you're getting there, following the ninth plague, and against the warning from Moses about the next plague, the death, which was the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh is still refusing to let the Hebrews go. And Moses then lays out the plan for his own people to avoid this plague, and he gives them very specific instructions here to keep the death angel out of their homes. And these instructions are a foreshadow of what Jesus would do 1,500 or so years later. And God also gives Moses specific instructions about keeping a memorial of this night for future generations, and an annual celebration, the Passover, and the week-long Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then in addition to this, God places the requirement of consecrating their firstborn as belonging to him. So the night of the Passover occurs, and it's just as God said it would, and Pharaoh finally resents, and he lets them go, and he doesn't place any conditions on them. And not only that, but the Egyptians want them out so badly that they'll give up their jewelry and their clothing to get them to leave. And so they plundered the Egyptians, and they left as conquerors. But God, knowing of the strong military presence along the short route to Canaan up the Mediterranean coastline, and because he had other plans for them, God directed them in a different direction. And to direct them, God provided a pillar of fire by night and pillar of cloud by day. So let's get into it. And Anita, would you want to start? Would you read verses 1 through 4, please?
14, right?
Yeah, chapter 14.
Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this.
Okay, so a little geography, maybe a lot of geography. But anyway, some of the locations here that she just read about are known and some aren't. But when the Hebrews left, they left from Ramses. Ramses is one of the store cities. Okay, Pithom, the other store city, is here, and Sukkot is right here. Okay, so they came from there down to here, and then God said, "Turn back." Okay? He said, "Turn back," and so when they turned back, this Migdol has been identified as somewhere up in this area. Okay, that's Migdol. All right, so that's where they end up, and that's where they're encamped. And they
And that route, because they're taking that kind of a route, Pharaoh's thinking they're lost.
exactly.
I got them.
Exactly. Yeah, and so the first stop being here at Sukkot, Etam is actually in this area right here, and Etam is actually a wilderness, but it is a mild wilderness compared to the wilderness, the rest of
It's
the
harsh.
wilderness out here. Yeah, it's not nearly as harsh. Okay, so we're identified as being up in here someplace. Right, that's where they are. Right now, in the wilderness that they are next to, we're going to find out this later as we get into chapter 15. The wilderness that they're adjacent to is the wilderness of Shur, and the wilderness of Shur is right here. Can you guys see that? It's right here. Right, so that's where we are in this thing. And it's going to appear, like Harvey just said, it's going to appear that they're wandering. And this is all part of the plan, and it's the plan to draw Pharaoh in. Okay, so God informs Moses of what Pharaoh's thought process will be. He assumes that the wilderness has shut them in. Okay, so he rightly assumes that the Hebrews don't want to go out into this wilderness. All right, so he knows that would be foolhardy, and so God says He's going to use this to get Pharaoh to pursue them, and this is going to result in a remarkable demonstration of God's power, and with the final judgment of Egypt and the destruction of their powerful military might. And so God will get the glory and not Pharaoh. Okay? All right, let's read on. Rick, you want to take 5 through 9?
When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So he had his chariots made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers all over them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites, who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses, and the chariots, horsemen, and troops pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth,
It's,
opposite
yeah,
Baal.
it's Pi-hahiroth.
Hahiroth?
Pi-hahiroth, yeah.
Hahiroth. Okay.
Okay, all right, so Pharaoh gets informed that the Hebrews had left town, and can't imagine why he was surprised over this, since he told them to get out anyway. But the reality of losing their labor force evidently sunk in, and Pharaoh and his servants had second thoughts. So Pharaoh intends to go after them and bring them back. And notice it says he took with him chariots, horsemen, and army. Right, now this is mentioned several times here throughout these passages, and I think it's to stress how terrifying this is to the Israelites. And Pharaoh is dead serious about getting his slaves back. Now in those days, very few nations have chariots. And I read where chariots had actually been invented by the Hyksos, and if you'll remember from previous lessons, that they ruled Lower Egypt for a time. Okay, so the Egyptians actually got that invention from somebody else. All right. So anyway, the use of chariots was a very serious advantage in those days. An analogy would be like the use of tanks in modern warfare. And if the number of Hebrews of fighting men were even as low as 6,000, like we talked about before, they had the numbers to fight, but they really weren't yet an army. All they knew how to do was to make bricks and work in the field. They'd never been trained militarily. Now, so in spite of what it says, the Israelites were going out defiantly. And I wonder what that looked like. What does it look like to go out defiantly? They thumb their nose at them as they're heading out of town. I don't know. It says they went out defiantly. So anyway, Pharaoh catches up with them while they're camped, and it says by the sea, and it doesn't say what sea it was. And these two places are not identified, but like I mentioned, the Migdol is. So it's going to be up here near the Mediterranean someplace. It's going to be up in that area.
Mine says with their fists raised. And
With
they
their
run.
fist raised? Okay.
I don't know
As long as they had their fists closed when they went out.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry, excuse me.
Well, I was just thinking too that later when they're building the tabernacle, there's gifted people, craftsmen, so they must have learned that someplace.
But possibly they were used as slaves in the building trade
Right,
or whatever.
right,
Could very
yeah.
well have been, you bet.
So Migdal doesn't show on the map, so?
Or the other places.
Depends on whose map you read.
True.
Depends on
looking at this
what
map
the
and it's
quality
not
of your map is.
Yep, that's true.
Okay.
Yes. All right, so anyway, they're up there near the Mediterranean, near a series of shallow lakes here. And we'll talk about those in just a little bit when we actually get to the crossing of the whatever sea it was. Okay. So April, would you read 10 through 14, please?
Okay, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians coming after them. The Israelites were terrified and cried out to the Lord for help. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Isn't this what we told you in Egypt? Leave us alone so that we may serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid, stand firm and see the Lord's salvation that he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you must be quiet."
So the Hebrews see the Egyptians coming, and it says they lifted up their eyes, and I think that's kind of an interesting way to put it. And they saw an imposing and terrifying sight. This is a huge army. It's chariots, it's horsemen, and foot soldiers, and they're on the march, heading right at them. And their response was to cry out to God. We aren't told what they said to God, but it does say what they said to Moses. In verses 11 through 12 here, you're going to see the word "you" used 3 times. They're laying all of this on Moses. And they even go so far as to remind Moses what they'd said to him early on. That was back when they had to gather their own straw. He says, "Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians." So what happened to all the plagues they'd seen? And the fact that God had protected them from it? What happened to their faith in fulfilling the requirements for the Passover and the result of that faith? And this response to adversity is going to be kind of a theme through all of their time in the wilderness. And it's like they have no memory. You know, and it's their faith hadn't matured enough for them to be able to handle each adversity as it came. And they had not yet experienced God enough for their faith to have grown, even though they had seen some pretty amazing things. And I don't think we should be too hard on these Hebrews.
I was
I
just
don't
gonna
either.
say that. I was gonna say, remember the wilderness and remember what it was like? I don't think any of us would be,
Yes. Yeah, and in human nature, it really hasn't changed all that
No,
much.
we'd be the same.
We aren't any different.
Now, do we ever question God and wonder why in the world he's doing what he's doing? Yeah.
Even though he just answered a prayer and you saw his hand at work, you still question.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, in my own life, it just seems like God waits until I whine about something before he brings the solution. You know, it's just like, you know, if I really want God to act, all I have to do is complain.
I guess I'm curious your perspective on, because, you know, when this goes on, this generation of Israelites have basically come up through 400 years of living in Egypt. Their faith had wandered, and it had become pretty minimal if it existed at all. Now God's calling his people back, sends Moses in, there's the opportunity, he does the plagues, it's really them getting the chance to see what God can do. And clearly it's pretty amazing. And he'll do these amazing things constantly. It's like, you know, he'll deliver them he'll deliver them from the Egyptian army, he'll be the crossing of the sea, he'll have the waters at Meribah. I mean, we'll go on and on and on, how God keeps delivering, keeps delivering, keeps delivering, keeps delivering. And they just can't get there. Faith-wise, this generation that comes out, they'll never get there. They just don't get there.
Absolutely.
And it's like, and so then it'll become the next generation that will have a different perspective, and then and really out of it, you've got Joshua and Caleb who really did believe that God can do it. But it's like, so you go through this transitional period, then it's the second generation that ends up coming in, not even including Moses. And so to me, I look at this transition, it's like from the time that God calls them out of here to the time they're in the promised land, there's a generation of people that did come, you know, you presume there's a faith in God, but it's a real weak faith. It's a very situational faith, I'll call it that. It's like, it's great until I got adversity, then I'm gonna cry out to God and complain, and then God delivers, it's like, oh, okay, good. Oh, there's another one, and it's like, it's just this constant thing. So I always kind of wonder about, you know, when God has a plan, it's like, why couldn't he have just picked a generation that could have just went right in? Why this hard transitional period? And it's really until later on when you read the prophets, it's like God's always referring back to see, remember when I delivered, remember when I did this, remember, it's always a testimony to him. And then finally it comes back to me, I guess my thought is, because it's all a testimony to God, what God can do. It all points back to him. What is your thought? I mean, just
Okay,
like,
yeah,
what monitor you're,
yeah, I do
I
have
threw a
some-
ton out there, but it's like,
I do have one thing to share about that. You've noticed that the generation of adults that came out of Egypt
yeah.
never did get the faith to go into the promised land. And it was their lack of faith that kept them out. Now that's key.
Including Moses.
Well, Moses was
For
disobedient.
different reasons.
Yeah, he was disobedient one time.
Yeah.
And it just was,
And
And
that was
Aaron was-
apparently enough for God, okay?
Yeah.
And you notice that the purpose of the 40 years in the wilderness was to get Egypt out of those that were coming out of Egypt, okay? And God was working up to a point where the spies came back and the people believed the 10 instead of the 2. And God said, that's enough. Okay, he finally got to the point where he said, that's enough. Okay, now, it's only your children that are gonna go into the promised land now. So it was the next generation that got to go. Because apparently, the generation that came out of Egypt never did get mature enough to understand and really believe God. Okay, so that's kind of what my take.
So it's
on
kind of
it
like they had to go through a de-Egyptianization
Yeah, it was a detox.
process.
Yeah, it was a detox process.
Yeah, so-
And,
You get the people out of Egypt, you can't get Egypt out of the people.
That's
so
right.
this is the
But you have to
process.
give the parents that didn't go in some credit, because obviously they were instilling some of the faith needed to that next generation for them to have, I mean, somebody had to teach them.
yeah, somebody had to teach
So-
them, but you realize but the ones who were not adults that came out of Egypt, they were children in Egypt. And so it was a lot easier to retrain them
True.
than it was to retrain the adults who had lived in this, you know, and were part of Egypt. So anyway, that's my thought.
Oh, interesting.
All right, where am I?
Okay. Sorry, I just.
No, that's good. No,
Verse
that's a
15,
good thing.
yeah.
Okay, yeah, all right, so, verse 13, anyway, we see Moses' response here, and it doesn't say if this response comes from Moses or if God had told him what had happened. But I love his response here, and I really want you to catch this. And this is a great word for us anytime we face adversity. Moses says to them, he says this, okay, he says, fear not, stand firm, keep your mouth shut, as in don't whine, and see what God will do. Now, how appropriate is that? Yeah, and you notice that what God tells them to do is the exact opposite of what our human nature is. Okay? Our nature is to be afraid, run from adversity, and whine about it. Right? So Moses tells them, he says, this is the last time you're going to see these Egyptians. Then after 400 years of servitude, they're going to be done with them. And I suspect that this was intended to give them a little needed encouragement. And it turns out that this is a true statement. This is the last time they're going to see these Egyptians. Okay, dear, you want to read 15 through 18?
Okay. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. And as for you, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on the dry land. And as for me, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord, when I am honored through Pharaoh, through his chariots and his horsemen."
So when God says, why do you cry out to me? I don't know if Moses had complained to God about this or whether the you refers to the people. But God's going to tell Moses exactly what's going to happen and what Moses and the people need to do. And notice the first thing that God tells them to do is to go forward. The first thing God needs them to do is step out in faith. They don't know what's going to happen, but he just says go. And they're between the sea and an approaching army there. And so to go forward would be to go toward the sea, which to them is a barrier. And they're going to go toward the very thing that blocks the solution to their problem. And the message here, I think, is you need to have the faith to press on and see how God overcomes the barriers. And so God's saying, don't just throw up your hands and say, that's it, we're done. heard the analogy of a boat on the water. It's impossible to steer a boat unless it's moving.
Oh.
So God wants them to learn to fear Him, not the barriers. And here's the statement that I love from one commentator. I just love this, so try to catch this. Whatever they're to face as a result of fearing Him is better for them than merely remaining alive in their present circumstances.
Can you do it again?
Yep.
I will. Whatever they're to face, now remember, these aren't my words, I copied these. Whatever they're to face as a result of fearing Him is better for them than merely remaining alive in their present circumstances. I thought that was great. All right, so in God's explanation of what will happen, He tells them not only will Pharaoh and his servants' heart be hardened, but now the Egyptians' hearts will be hardened as well. And he's probably referring there to the soldiers. Enough that they're willing to follow the Hebrews into the sea. And that had to be pretty daunting because they'd never seen anything like this before. And this is to be the final act in God getting the glory over Pharaoh and his army. And in the Egyptians getting to know this God of the Hebrews, and which is mentioned repeatedly here, is a kind of theme throughout the plagues. And no doubt this incident will become known throughout Egypt and possibly the neighboring nations as well as they go forward. Okay, let's go. Matt, you want to read 19 through 20, please?
Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long.
Okay. So now, in order for this cloud before the position, it's really hard to tell whether this is night or day. And I guess I'm guessing it's night because they actually went through the sea at nighttime. Yeah, so they did it. They went through at night apparently. But anyway, the fact that the cloud was before them, for this cloud that was before them to move to the position, it indicates that they had turned away from the oncoming Egyptian army, were now facing the sea, okay? Because the cloud now is behind them. So they must have followed God's direction and to go forward. All right,
So the Israelites were in the dark and the Egyptians were in the light.
well, that's a good question.
Because if they went
Cloud
through
was
in the
dark
dark,
at night without one coming near. Yeah, I don't, my translation is just a little bit different than that, so.
Well,
It's really, it's confusing to me and I don't know how to explain it.
well, yeah. It looks like a storm, it would be like a storm. You wouldn't wanna go into it. If it were dark over there and you're in the light, it's like,
I don't
and the
know.
Egyptians wouldn't go there.
Could be right. I don't know how to, yeah.
It was a pillar of fire at night, right?
Normally.
Normally it would be, yeah, but it said that there was the cloud and the fire and well, whatever it was, it served its purpose.
Yeah.
The purpose was to keep the two parties separated throughout the night. Okay, that's what it did. And one commentator suggested that this darkness kind of harkens back to the darkness that preceded the killing of the firstborn. The darkness is about to precede another mass killing here. And the reference to the angel of the Lord is often used to represent God himself. And regardless of whether this was God or his angel, it's God who provided this separation for his people. But with the appearance of God as an angel at the burning bush, and then as an angel in the cloud, we can see that the presence of God at the beginning and the end of bringing the Hebrews out, we see and the creation of the nation of Israel. God's there from the beginning to the end. And we'll see, as we'll see, God isn't done yet. So
Well,
Trevor, yeah.
One of the first signs the people should have been able to see is now the cloud's not in front of them, God's moved it to behind them, and you should be going, what's going on here? Should be seeing a little bit more faith there that God's protecting us.
All right, so Trevor, you want to read 21 through 25, please? Sure.
Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back with a powerful east wind all that night and turned the sea into dry land. So the waters were divided. And the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with the waters like a ball to them on their right and their left. The Egyptians set out in pursuit, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen, and went into the sea after them. During the morning watch, the Lord looked down at the Egyptian forces from the pillar of fire and cloud and threw the Egyptian forces into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve and made them drive with difficulty. "Let's get away from Israel," the Egyptians said, "because the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt."
So the crossing of the sea begins with Moses doing what God told him to do, and that's to stretch out his hand over the sea, and I'm presuming here he's using God's staff again. And up comes an east wind. It says the wind blew all night. Wind may be a natural phenomenon, but it says clearly that God brought the wind. And the result being apparently the channel through the sea with a wall of water on either side. And this had to have been a pretty amazing sight. To venture into this channel, it must have taken some courage. It was definitely not a secure situation. But they did it, and right after them came the Egyptians. But God caused a panic among the Egyptians, and some of your translations say their chariot wheels bogged down, some say they came off, or whatever. But whatever it was, it caused the chariots to come to a grinding halt in the middle of the sea, between the water walls. And the Egyptians recognized what was happening to them. It says that Yahweh was fighting for Israel. So they're getting a picture of who this God is. And you might recall I said in the introduction of one of the other books that one of the big reasons that God had the Bible written is to show the world who he really is. And the Egyptians are getting a good lesson here. And so are the Israelites. And from what they had seen so far, no wonder the army of Pharaoh was in a panic and they wanted to bug out. And it appears that what God has done is to strike the Egyptians in their symbol of power, and that was their chariots. Okay? Which was the very thing that struck fear into the Egyptians.
What time is the morning watch? Is that 6?
Yes. Well,
Or typically later
the day began at 6 a.m.
So this would be like early, basically the morning watch is just gonna be somewhere around 6 or sometime very early in the morning.
I would think so, yeah.
My footnote says he removed their chariot wheels.
Does that make a difference?
Walk them off of there.
Yeah.
That's when the wheels come off.
Somebody didn't tighten the nut down tight enough. So, I guess it's like God saying to the Israelites, don't worry, I'll take care of the very thing you fear. In fact, you didn't need to fear it in the first place. Another timeless principle here. All right, let's go. See, Rick, you've already read. Nancy, 26 to 31, please.
Sure. When all the Israelites had reached the other side, the Lord said to Moses, "Raise your hand over the sea again. Then the waters will rush back and cover the Egyptians and their chariots and charioteers." So as the sun began to rise, Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the water rushed back into its usual place. The Egyptians tried to escape, but the Lord swept them into the sea. Then the waters returned and covered all the chariots and charioteers, the entire army of Pharaoh. Of all the Egyptians who had chased the Israelites into the sea, not a single one survived. But the people of Israel had walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground, as the waters stood up like a wall on both sides. That is how the Lord rescued Israel from the hand of the Egyptians that day. And the Israelites saw the bodies of the Egyptians washed upon the seashore. When the people of Israel saw the mighty power that the Lord had unleashed against the Egyptians, they were filled with awe before him. They put their faith in the Lord and in his servant Moses.
Presumably, the Israelites are now across, and so God tells Moses to do his thing again. It says this happened in the morning. Imagine it took all night for the Israelites to get across. This was a pretty big group of people there. But the pursuing Egyptians are still out there. They're still out there between the water walls there. And as the sea returns to its original state, the Egyptian army is swallowed up. And it says this was only the horsemen and the chariots, not to mention the foot soldiers. But whoever was out there, it says all of them died. And God is finished with his judgment of the Egyptians and their gods now. And Pharaoh, who claimed that this God was not worthy of knowing or obeying, has his kingdom in shambles at the hand of this God. And as for the Israelites, what had just amazingly happened right before their eyes was conclusive proof that the power of their God was something to be feared. And it says they were saved from the hand of the Egyptians, referring to their power. And this resulted in the strengthening of their belief, not only in their God, who they now knew to be working on their behalf, but in Moses as leader as well.
Have you heard about the theory or whatever that it's the Sea of Reeds and it
Yeah,
was
we'll-
shallow and
We'll talk
that's,
about that.
yeah.
We'll get to that.
Yep.
So, and so one thing that God wants for each of us is for our faith to grow.
Yeah.
And he'll use circumstances in our lives, whether they're pleasant or whether they're unpleasant, to facilitate this. But for the Israelites, they're now out from under the power and authority of Egypt after 400 years, and they are their own nation now, serving their God. Okay? And although God never had really done that. All right, so what I want to do, take some time here, is to talk about what and where they may have actually crossed. Right now, the Hebrew word translated Red Sea are the words Yamsuf, which is best translated as Sea of Reeds. It's most likely a reference to papyrus reeds. And papyrus reeds do not grow along salt water. They grow only along fresh water. Okay. Now the word sea could refer to any sizable body of water, like Sea of Galilee, which is fresh water, not necessarily salt water. And the translation of Yamsuf as the Red Sea, I've read this, comes from the Septuagint. And when the Committee of 70 there translated the Hebrew into Greek, somehow it came out the Red Sea. And that's the way it's been translated into English ever since, according to the commentators that I read. Now, where the Suez Canal is now, there was prior to its construction, a series of shallow lakes. They're not there anymore because of the canal, but the southernmost of those and the largest of those are called the Bitter Lakes. They're down in this area right here. Okay. So and we know the area where the Israelites were camped and confronted by the Egyptian army. It was somewhere up in this area. Okay. Right. And we know that it says that the wilderness had hemmed them in. Okay. So they have to be over here someplace. Right? And they hadn't yet ventured into the wilderness. And we know where they came out of the Sea of Reeds. So somebody want to read, just skip ahead to chapter 15 and read verse 22.
Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur.
Okay, so like I said before, the wilderness of Shur is right here. This is where that wilderness is. Right? Okay, so keep that in mind. Right? Yeah, so I'm going to make a case that was one of these lakes that the nation of Israel actually crossed. Other places you'll see offered are the northern tip of the Gulf of Suez, up in here, and you'll even hear some recently, at least, that they actually crossed the Gulf of Aqaba. And if that's the case, then it would put Mount Sinai, instead of in the southern part of Sinai, it's actually into Saudi Arabia. Right? And there's some good evidence for that, but one that would have to have a completely different interpretation of the actual text in order to get to this right here.
Wouldn't they have had to travel a long ways to get there though, too?
Yeah, exactly, and the timing doesn't really lend itself to that. I don't know where this came from.
Chariot wheels have been found.
Yeah, actually they have. Chariot wheels have been found under the sea right there. Yeah. Actually they have. Although okay. But anyway, I'm prepared to back this somebody read verses 1 through 3?
These are the journeys of the sons of Israel by which they came out from the land of Egypt by their armies under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. And Moses recorded their starting places according to their journeys by the command of the Lord. And these are the journeys according to their starting places. And they journeyed from Ramses in the first month on the 15th day of the first month. On the next day after the Passover, the sons of Israel started out boldly in the sight of all the Egyptians.
Okay, so this is a recounting of every single stop on their Exodus journey as recorded by Moses, right? And we know where they started. They started at Ramses. The first stop was Sukkot. Next, okay, now I want to go to verse 5, and somebody read, well, I'm going to stop a few places, so I'll just read it myself here, okay? So it says, the people of Israel set out from Ramses and camped at Sukkot, and they set out from Sukkot and they camped at Etam, which is on the edge of the wilderness, okay? So Etam here, they had to have been camped over here someplace, right in here, right? All right, so, and so then going on, and they camped before Migdol, which is somewhere up in this area, right? And then they set out from before Haharot and passed through the midst of the sea into the wilderness. Okay, so from the sea into the wilderness we know as the wilderness of Shur. So that's here. Okay, and when we have, we're going to have some other incidents here. They went 3 days' journey into the wilderness of Etam and camped at Marah. And they set out from Marah and came to Elim. And at Elim there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. And they camped there. And they set out from Elim and camped by the Red Sea. Okay, so then we have Marah and the Elim incidents. Those places are not identified. Okay, nobody knows for sure where those are. From Elim they went to camp by the Red Sea. That doesn't help us any either. And from there, they went to it. Okay, let's move on here. And they set out from the Red Sea and camped in the wilderness of Sin. Okay, now, the wilderness of Sin is down here.
Oh.
That is
So
where
they
that
traveled.
is. Okay? Right. So if that's the case, it eliminates this. Okay, see that?
So they couldn't have crossed that.
Couldn't cross the Gulf of Aqaba. Not unless they crossed it, well, they could, but. Right, so anyway, where am I?
You're down at Mount Sinai.
Okay. And they set out from the wilderness of Sin and camped at, Dovka. They set out from Dovka and they camped at Alush. These places are not identified, by the way. Okay, anyway, they got to Rephidim, where there was no water. And then Rephidim, and they camped in the wilderness of Sinai. Wilderness of Sinai is right here. Okay? All right, so we're getting a picture here of exactly where it was they went. All right, now, where am I here? Skip down. And verse 36, they set out from Abranah, and they camped at Ezion Geber, and they set out from Ezion Geber, and they camped in the wilderness of Zin, that is Kadesh. So anyway, what it says is from here, they ended up in this area up here.
Ooh,
Okay?
bad desert.
Yeah. Okay, so anyway, now, I'm not going to die on that hill, right? But it's just what I believe from the text. Okay, you read from the text, that's what it looks like, right? Now, regardless of any of that, the important thing is the message, not the locations. God miraculously delivered them from the Egyptians, and they exited from whatever they crossed into the wilderness, and were thereby finally free from the bondage to the Egyptians.
But I think what the text also makes clear is wherever the crossing point was over a body of water, it was sufficient that they could not cross it. It was hemmed in. It was whatever the body was. It was formidable enough that they could not cross it.
Right.
And
They were
it was
trapped.
also, and so, but it was also formidable enough could swamp and eliminate an entire Egyptian army, so, you know, a little
Can't
pond,
be.
you know, it's like, you know,
It
a
wasn't a boat.
little pond or ankle-high water wouldn't suffice for that. So it's gotta be a body of water sufficient that it creates a wall, they couldn't cross it.
That's right.
Only by removing that, through that event, could they cross it. And that event was sufficient enough to wipe out an entire section of the Egyptian army, which it had to have been pretty significant
Right.
to do that. So whether that's north, south, wherever it is, that body of water is pretty significant regardless.
Sure, and we could argue all day about where that was.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
And in the end, it really doesn't make any difference.
Yeah.
Right.
What matters is what you just said. Yeah.
And the people clearly after that event, it was enough for them to say, there was no natural cause to attribute it to. They clearly believed God did this, so whatever it was had to have been in their eyes quite miraculous. And that, I always like to say that because it's like when you get into some discussions, I mean, everybody wants to go to the God of the gaps. In other words, you couldn't explain it, so you just say God did it, because you couldn't explain it. It's like, in this case, it's the most rational explanation.
Sure.
Because there is no natural explanation for what just occurred,
Right.
so.
Right.
Whether it's
Yeah,
funny.
yeah, walls of water on both sides don't just occur in nature,
No.
On a regular basis,
not in
yeah.
recent history at least.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah,
natural
and it-
flooding or something.
Well,
Anyway, go ahead.
yeah, well, anyway, they're finally free, and God has subjected the Egyptians to their final judgment.
Yeah.
So now they're gonna begin the wilderness part of their journey. So, we are to Exodus chapter 15. Now, the first 21 verses of this chapter deal with the celebration of Israel's miraculous deliverance from the Egyptians.
Yeah.
And it follows what it says in the very end of chapter 14. So would somebody read the last verse at the end of chapter 14?
When Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses.
Okay, so based upon what they'd seen and experienced, they feared and they believed. And it was not only in Yahweh, but also in Moses' leadership. So his rating had gone up a little bit there. So someone, it doesn't say who, whips up this song and everybody joins in. And this song is a song of praise and exaltation. It's aimed at God for who God is.
It's, you know, it's gotta be a
demonstrated by
Mike,
what he has done.
you know, it's gotta be a Mike Pritchard kind of person.
Yeah.
It's just,
Rips up.
or Roger, just some
Yeah.
worshipy kind of person.
Yeah, you know, and this is a common occurrence in Scripture, knowing God by what he's done. As throughout the years, this song has been titled the Song of Moses, it's been called the Song of Miriam. It's been called the Song of Moses and Miriam. For the Jews, however, it was none of the above. For them, it was the Song by the Sea.
Oh,
Okay, so let's read this. See, Janny, are you next?
I can be.
Okay, 1 through 5, please.
All right. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him. For Father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea. The best of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone.
So right off here, we see this is a song of celebration of God's triumph over the might of Pharaoh's army. And also we see how their estimation of God has risen because of it. And in their eyes, God has become a God of strength, a God of salvation, and he's a warrior. And they now have claimed that, their father's God as their very own. And I'm suspecting here that this is probably a reference to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they're recognizing him by his name, Yahweh. And now remember, one of God's purposes throughout all the plagues is that they would come to know him. again, you'll see this pattern throughout the Bible. God is a show me God, and so far, it's mission accomplished, right? So Harvey, you wanna take 6 through 10?
Sure.
Well,
Yeah.
I have that all marked and underlined, because it's so true today,
Oh,
that it's a reminder and, to look at what he's done and
Sure.
be encouraged.
Yeah, you know, I think, you know, none of us have probably had lives quite as dramatic as this one, that these people have, but still, we can all look back. You know, we have that ability to have hindsight and look back and see the things that we know God has worked in our lives. You know, and so, that's God's purpose for us. He wants those things to build our faith. Okay, and that's.
Helps you
that's
get through
exactly
the
what it's
hardships.
here. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we should be marking it down.
True.
So that when you,
Remembering.
so that when you get in a position of fear or whatever, you
Yeah.
go back and you say, oh, I remember that, I remember that. God is faithful.
Yeah, some people keep prayer journals, which I've never had the enthusiasm.
Yeah.
And they are able to go back and see those things. Okay, 6 through 10, Harvey.
Your right hand, O Lord, is majestic in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy. And in greatness of your excellence, you overthrow those who rise up against you. You send forth your burning anger, and it consumes them as chaff. By the blast of your nostrils, the waters were piled up. The flowing waters stood up like a heap. The deeps were congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall be gratified against them. I will draw out my sword, my hand will destroy them. You blew with your wind, the sea covered them, they sank like lead in the mighty waters.
So in these verses, here we have a description of how God had demonstrated his power. And we see words like power, shatters, fury, consumed, followed by what had happened to Pharaoh's army. And so I think we're gonna need to stop there and we can pick that up